Hello, or maybe I should say good evening, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today, for the second time, I wish to say in a row, but it's not in a row, is Brandon Weichert, the author of a book about space. We talked about a year ago, more or less, the expert on space, military, space-related issues, geopolitics, great power competition. And today we're going to talk about all this. Hello, Brandon. How are you?
Hello, Jacek. Thank you for having me again.
Okay. So let's get started. What was exactly this thing that the Chinese launched and it landed somewhere? You know, there are so many theories about it in Europe, in US. I've read all of it, but you tell me, I want to know your opinion about it.
Well, my opinion is, so there's two big events that China did in the military space side. The first was a couple weeks back from now, they tested, it's believed, a hypersonic glide vehicle that, as you noted, did circumnavigate the world and did land within 20 miles of its intended target. And the other thing that occurred was very recently, China has in geosynchronous orbit tested a satellite crushing satellite. So these two things give China a huge strategic advantage over the United States. In the case of the hypersonic glide vehicle, that's probably more radical and sort of more of a game changer than the satellite weapon they tested. But the hypersonic glide vehicle is truly a game changer because the United States Air Defense Network does not have the ability to actually defend against an incoming hypersonic weapon. This is a vehicle that travels as slow as Mach 4, but China does have the world's most advanced hypersonic wind tunnel where they can test vehicles up to Mach 30. So we don't know how fast exactly this was going, but we do know it was, in fact, a hypersonic vehicle. China says, no, this was just a friendly civilian space technology. It was a test of an unmanned reusable plane, kind of like the X-37B, which is the Air Force's reusable unmanned plane, like a mini shuttle. But as I noted in my book, space is one of the areas where you have a lot of dual use technologies. So something that can be used to take pictures in peacetime can easily be converted into, in fact, a hypersonic glide vehicle. And the thing about a hypersonic glide vehicle, whereas America's air defense network, and I'm talking about continental United States, not even some of our bases, I'm talking about the homeland, whereas our homeland defenses are primed to track and destroy conventional missiles coming along an east-west or west-east axis of attack, we are not as well suited to defending against a polar attack. That's north-south or south-north. And that is the kind of attack that these hypersonic glide vehicles could conceivably conduct on the United States. So that's the ability China has now to circumvent all of our expensive air defense systems and to deliver payloads, whether it be conventional or nuclear, on any target in the continental United States within probably a half hour of launching. So that's a pretty significant game changer.
Yeah, but one, I want to be very precise for our audience that is quite sophisticated, because you have, of course, hypersonic glide vehicle, which, according to the regular hypersonic glide vehicles, they just are launched and they make a lob in space and they are drawn back by gravity towards the earth and they maneuver while, re-entering.
Right.
Okay, but I understand that this was something different, though, because it, made a few rounds around the globe, or wasn't. So this is sort of a more, complex.
It is more complex. System. Yeah. So they're using what's known as a ramjet, which basically allows this piece of equipment to maneuver. The problem with hypersonic vehicles traditionally has been they get very hot when they're traveling at full speed. And so they're sort of dumb. They don't really maneuver. They can burn up very easily. This is why we've had so much trouble in the United States building out a real capability. But China, with this new hypersonic wind tunnel where they can test vehicles for longer and larger vehicles, it allows them to really refine a capability. So yes, this vehicle in particular is believed to have done very advanced, sophisticated maneuverings while in orbit. And what that means is that they can really deliver this thing anywhere they need to on Earth.
Yeah,
and so this is why China's saying, no, this is a reusable space plane.
And moreover, it is stealthy in a way, space stealthy, because they can orbit it first, keep it there, moving around without energy, spending. And like in 2 days or 3 days or 5 days, they can decide to deorbit it against the target. So I think
it's important to reiterate for your audience, because I was just with the Air Force in June talking about this issue. And so I'm wondering if maybe our intel services knew something was coming, because it's believed the hypersonic Chinese test was done in August. They're just releasing it in the last few weeks, the information. But in June, they were talking, the Air Force was, about how do we respond to a potential hypersonic attack on the homeland. And what we were finding when we were doing these talks, these simulations, we were finding that, in fact, most of America's defense systems are not up to date. They cannot protect against this particular weapon. They're very good for protecting against an old school, Soviet type or Russian ICBM attack, or even a Chinese ICBM attack, but not against a hypersonic attack. And so we have all this money. It's sort of like, and in the next edition I'm doing right now of Winning Space, we're doing a second edition. I have a new chapter in there about the Maginot Line and how America's air defense system, when going up against this hypersonic vehicle, could be like the Maginot Line that the French built to fight the Germans. They were fighting the war before, and the Germans had figured out how to use new age technologies to completely outmaneuver all those fancy French defenses. And my worry is that something similar is going on here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and tell us something more about the second event at the geosynchronous orbit. Was it just a straight ramming? Something was launched and straight up? Or it was staying there for some time and then suddenly it ran?
Yeah, so the Chinese launched, they said it was a satellite, but now our intelligence services have gone back, and this is open source now. It's out in the press now. But basically, the Space Force and our intel services now have reassessed and said this was not a conventional communications satellite, that this thing has robotic arms. And I talk about this in the opening, if you remember, in the opening chapter of my book, A Space Pearl Harbor. Now, at the time of the book coming out, really only Russia had this capacity. But now the Chinese have demonstrated an actual capability that's very similar to what the Russians have spent the last 10 years building out. The Russians call it Istrebitel Sputnikov. The Chinese have a different name for it, but it's the same concept. So basically, this thing in geosynchronous orbit, which is the furthest orbit, it's Earth's orbit still, but it's the highest one up. And that's where all of America's most sensitive nuclear command, control, and communication satellites are. That's where a lot of our very fancy, sophisticated surveillance equipment is. That's where the Navy's MUOS, multi-user objective service domain system, that's where that satellite constellation is. So those satellites are expensive, hard to replace. And if this Chinese kill vehicle, which can tailgate our bigger systems quietly, and then at the drop of a hat, speed up, latch on, and either crush those satellites like a can or push them out of their orbits where we can't retrieve them, they've just rendered America deaf, dumb, and blind. And when you pair that up with the newfound Chinese hypersonic capability, you now have the makings of what could be a truly frightening potential of surprise space Pearl Harbor type attack. Because the goal of the Chinese would be to blind us in space so that they can do something closer to home, like take Taiwan, annex more of the South or East China Sea, maybe attack India more, something that would keep us completely delayed from responding so that our allies can't depend on us. And then the Chinese are telling these people, hey, if you don't want to fight us, you better make a deal with us because America's down for the count now. And we're going to be too busy at home trying to rebuild and fix everything that the Chinese think we might be more inclined to negotiate rather than try to hit back.
Mm-hmm. And how long this Chinese procedure took? They launched and then they rammed, or they watching it?
And then, what they said it was. So
because it's far away. It's 36,000 kilometers from Earth.
Right. That's right. Absolutely. So what they said it was first they said it was a communications satellite. And then, of course, they had to backtrack. They said, well, actually, the robotic claws, this is for cleaning up space debris because, and this is true, space junk is a huge hazard to anyone wanting to conduct operations in space. But as the Space Force, the U.S. Space Force pointed out, that same system that can be used to grab space junk and move it out of the way of other spacecraft or satellites can be used to track, tailgate, and then clamp on to sensitive U.S. systems and knock them out. And so they did a demonstration, the Chinese did, collecting large pieces of space junk in orbit. And they said, see, it works. We can move the junk. We can make shipping, easier in space. Orbits will be safer, et cetera. But the Pentagon's saying, yeah, but in wartime, that same system, given that it's in a geosynchronous orbit, can track and push out our systems. And I think that's the real objective of that program.
Also, around this Kabul evacuation thing, there were rumors that the U.S. Space Force was planning to do some big demonstration of force or capabilities.
Yeah,
and it was of course abandoned, because of the Kabul thing, and
that's right.
So what was? Do you know what it was supposed to be? What was it planned to be?
So 2 years ago, when former President Trump remember, he's kind of the godfather of the Space Force. I know he's unpopular, but as I say in my book, that's the one thing that I think everybody should agree on is that he did that very well.
We all remember also the farewell, message at the airport when he left the office, that he mentioned that he created U.S.
That's right. And there's a big deal because 2 years ago, General Hyten, Air Force, he's the number 2 at the Pentagon right now. He came up his career, he was always involved with space operations for the Air Force. He wanted to do this demonstration in orbit to send a message to the Russians as well as the Chinese that for whatever you all are building, we also have the capability to threaten you in space. Trump said, don't do it. This was back in 2018, 2019. They held off doing it. And then, as you know, right before this whole Kabul thing, the evacuation happened in Afghanistan, General Hyten was agitating for the Biden administration to let him do an in-orbit demonstration of this weapon. We don't know officially what it was. It was scary enough, though, that the Biden administration said, hold off. We're going to need to work with the Russians and Chinese on some things. We don't want to start going too far on this sort of escalation. Just hold off. What I think it was probably some space projectile weapon. I think that I don't know for sure. I don't know for sure.
Projectile, not energy directed weapon. Yeah.
I don't think so. I know this is energy-directed weapons is something that I've been advocating for. It's something the Air Force has wanted, but I don't think the technology is there yet. I don't think we've invested in it. And I could be wrong. Maybe they do have something, which would be wonderful because that could really sort of put America back in the driver's seat in terms of dealing with China. Because right now, China, if you listen to their propaganda for sure, China thinks the future already belongs to them and we're sort of just dying in front of them, withering in front of them. And so that a directed energy weapons test would be wonderful if we did that. I don't know if the technology is yet there on our end. But I do know that we've been developing sort of projectile type weapons, kinetic kill vehicles and things like that. Whether we've tested it or not, I don't know, but I think it's related to either a projectile-based defensive weapon or an energy-based one. But either event, that would have been a big deal in terms of restoring the credibility of our deterrence, which, as my colleague Rebecca Heinrichs over at the Hudson Institute, and I've been saying, our credibility in deterrence is withering right now. And so that would have been huge. But I think that's what it was, but I do not know for sure. And if I did know, I probably couldn't say.
Yeah, but let's speculate about
sure.
what sort of projectile could that be, and what would that be in the low Earth orbit demonstration, or?
Yeah, it would be a low Earth orbit demonstration. It would probably be something that could knock one of the Chinese or Russian satellite killing satellites, those grappling arm, they call them the space stalkers at the RAND Corporation. So you knock one of those things out of orbit before they can get near to our systems. We know the Russians in, I think, April of 2019 tested an anti-satellite weapon in orbit that the British freaked out about. And there was this big diplomatic row between London and Moscow. So this could be a similar system that America developed to sort of check the Russians. Another thing could be a missile defense system. Maybe this is something related to hypersonics. We know that the Americans have been trying desperately to get ahead in hypersonic. So it's very possible that maybe this is some kind of either space-based, defense system, or maybe this itself was a test of a hypersonic vehicle of some kind. We don't know. But it's probable this is related to low Earth orbit, and it was some kind of kinetic weapon, which is probably why the Biden administration and even the Trump administration before that held off, because that could be a big issue legally, right? You're not really supposed to weaponize space according to the Outer Space Treaty. Of course, as I say in my book, there's a lot of wiggle room there, a lot of room for interpretation. Certainly the Russians and Chinese have different interpretations of that treaty. But in case of America, I think one of the reasons the two Trump and Biden administrations held off on testing whatever this weapon was because it was significant enough that it might put America in kind of legal, hot water with the international community. But at some point, we're going to have to test these weapons, because China and certainly Russia have had no compunction about testing their systems for the last few years. And at some point, we're going to have to send a message in the real world that, hey, we can do this too, and maybe we can do something you can't.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the hypersonic weapons, as we all know, there are basically there are two kinds: hypersonic glide vehicle that lobs into the space and then gets back, maneuvering with decreasing speed but still hypersonic speed. And this is the easier one, right? The simpler one. And there is a hypersonic cruise missile, right, which is a real hypersonic and much more difficult.
The Russians, I think, are the ones who are really pioneering that technology.
Yeah, but it doesn't get to space. I think that this should be the perfect weapon of choice for the US, projecting power to Eurasia from across the ocean.
Yes.
So where are we at that? What is your take on that?
Well, in terms of, let me kind of section off these two things. So in terms of the hypersonic glide vehicle, this is the one the Air Force really wants. This is the one that I think everybody wants, because now China's demonstrated this capability. In the last week, the United States military attempted to test its own hypersonic glide vehicle. It was not a success, or at least the results were mixed. In fact, I think it was General Hyten again of the Air Force, who basically went to Congress recently and was complaining about the fact that the United States has only in the last few years done something like 9 tests of any hypersonic glide vehicle, whereas China has done hundreds and Russia's even done, I think, almost as much or more. So in terms of real world testing, which is where you really learn sort of the refinement of the technology, you don't do it in the lab, you have to test it in the real world. The Chinese and the Russians are likely ahead of us in the hypersonic glide vehicle. Hypersonic cruise missile, I think the ones who dominate that in the real world right now is Russia. And I might be wrong about that, but I'm fairly certain that that's the Russians who've really been fixated a lot on that. And I agree with you. In terms of geopolitics and the fact that we are so far removed from Eurasia, yet we have so much interest there, we have to project power from that favorite word of the Biden administration over the horizon. A hypersonic cruise missile, I think, would not only be cheaper and more practical than the hypersonic glide vehicle, as important as it is, but the hypersonic cruise missile would, exactly as you say, give America a lot of near-term advantages in being able to project power in a Eurasia that is increasingly contested and increasingly closed off to traditional forms of American military power projection. And in that way, I think we should be doing a massive surge in investment of R&D. I don't think it would be very difficult for us to do this. It's an issue of political will. And this has been, as you know, from my time working in government on the policymaking side, the Capitol Hill side, my biggest complaint, and this is why I wrote the book, was that there's this inertia within the bureaucracy. It doesn't matter which party's in power. There's an inertia to do anything significantly new, anything radical. It's met with, significant obstacles. And I think it's just because Washington's gotten very complacent in the way it does business. But I do think you're right. I think that a hypersonic cruise missile is a lot more doable in the near term than a hypersonic glide vehicle. And I think it has, as you say, real world applications. And so I would love to see us do that. I do think that's something we could do a lot more easily than the hypersonic glide vehicle.
And still, by paradox, I think that it would be the hypersonic cruise missile that travels in the, in air of our planet without getting into space. That will bring the war into space. You know why? Because when it travels with hypersonic speeds, only in the air, disturbing the line of horizon because it moves so fast. It's so difficult to detect and track it and aim, and keep queuing on it. In the land-based or sea-based defense. So the sensors detecting it and maybe also the effectors killing it will have to be taken into space to make this kind of weapon ineffective. Otherwise that will be a full domination of the battlefield, terrestrial battlefield, and everything will become tactical from strategic ranges. And the space will break this kill chain.
You're right. And there was a report that came out, and I think it was either Northrop or Boeing, maybe it was Lockheed. It was one of the big defense contractors in the last 6 months. They basically, it was a 200-page report for Congress where basically these two engineers for the company said the only way you can break that kill chain, that hypersonic kill chain, is by having a mixed system where you have on-Earth kind of, air defense systems, but you have to have space-based sensors and space-based defense systems to knock out those hypersonic vehicles that make it into high Earth atmosphere or into orbit. And so you're right. Space is, as I say, space is the ultimate strategic high ground. And if whoever takes it will control the destiny, and I know this is what Everett Dolman says as well, will control the destiny of all the lower terrestrial domains. And so you're right. Space-based, whether it's a defensive system, a tracking system, whatever, some combination of the two, space is the key in either event.
True. So where are we in that context? My next question would go to the U.S. Space Force. How does the Space Force feel, in this new great era, in this new era of great power competition? How is the recruiting process? How is the the skills? How are the operations of the concepts? Tell me something. What happened within the last year since we talked last time?
Well, unfortunately, the good news is Space Force was not killed during the transition from Trump to Biden. If you remember, in April of this year, the White House press secretary made some pretty inartful comments denigrating Space Force. And with less than 24 hours, somebody in the White House told her, you better get on the air and walk that back because we need Space Force. So that's a good thing. There's obviously, in this age of partisan vitriol, there is some degree of bipartisan agreement that, hey, this is something we need. Now, the bad news. The bad news is the acquisitions report just came out from the Pentagon, in which Congress asked them to do a one-year checkup. Has Space Force really sort of reinvigorated or innovated the acquisitions process, the way that the military purchases and deploys and develops weapons systems as they relate to the high-tech kind of space side? What they found, they did a survey of people in the Space Force who are experts in acquisition. It was a very candid assessment. They found that a majority or almost a majority of those in Space Force say that Space Force has not fundamentally reinvigorated or innovated the way that the military acquires and deploys space-based weapons. Or space-based systems, I should say. this is a big problem because, as somebody who was at least on the periphery involved with the Trump administration's creation of Space Force, the biggest reason for why the Trump administration created a new branch of the military was not to create more bureaucracy, but instead it was to streamline that all-important procurement or acquisitions process, which, as I note in my book, I have a whole chapter on it, that process, that program in the Pentagon, the way we acquire weapons has not fundamentally changed since at least the Goldwater-Nichols Act in the 1980s, which means we're using 20th century, analog type procurement methods when really we should be using mid-21st century sort of digital or post-digital methods of acquiring technologies at a faster clip at a cheaper rate than our enemies can. There's an interesting report that came out looking at China's defense spending adjusted for purchasing power parity. And what they found was that China spends only 2% of their economy on military on defense, and yet with that 2%, they're actually getting greater bang for their buck, because while we in America rightly love private sector innovation and liberty and all of that, the one upside those Chinese state-owned defense firms have is they can force systems that are complex to be created at relatively cheap rates. If you remember, the reason private contractors, what they tend to do in America is they take a big contract, they spend a fraction of it on actually building out the weapon systems, and then the rest they keep for themselves as a profit. And so this is one of the reasons why the Zumwalt class destroyer for the Navy was such a disaster, because it was this very expensive contract, very complex thing that they tried to build on the cheap. Whereas in the Chinese system, they are streamlining that sort of payment plus capabilities development package, because they don't have to worry about the bottom line. Of course, that also leads to a lot of misspent assets. But at the end of the day, generally speaking, they're spending only 2% of their economy on defense and getting much greater bang for their buck in the high-tech military domain, as opposed to the United States, which I think spends like 3.5%. We spend a much significantly larger share of our budget on defense, and we're not getting as much bang for our buck. So what that means is that, China's figuring it out. They're developing a system where they can test and possibly beat the Americans, not just in space, but in all the high-tech domains. And meanwhile, we've created this wonderful Space Force, this idea of a Space Force, but we haven't done anything at the physical procurement level, at the acquisitions level, to really streamline the process. And in terms of recruitment, I'm very upset. I know more. Look, diversity is amazing. It's excellent. This is a strength of our country. But the problem and I said this to the Space Force recruiting their social media team when I was talking to them about 6 months ago. I know more that Space Force is dedicated to diversity than I do know what their mission is. And that's a problem, because if I'm a young recruit, diversity is great, but I want to fight. I want a Star Wars. I want Star Trek. People going into that field probably were inspired on some level by pop culture. And the fact that Space Force is not taking advantage of that to generate interest and recruitment is very telling, I think. You have people in charge at the Space Force level, and I say this with all due respect, I'm speaking generally. You have people in charge of the Space Force level who I think are far too conservative, with the lowercase c, in the application of space power, and far more skeptical of the potential of space dominance. That's an ugly word in today's Washington, by the way. They like space superiority. They don't like space dominance. I think we need to get back into that mindset of dominating space, and you need to have people in charge at Space Force who are going to knock some heads together. We don't want nice guys and gals. We want people who are going to go in there and be the scrappy underdogs. We want the Billy Mitchells of this generation. And we don't have that right now, sadly, in Space Force. And that means, we're going to fall behind even more than we already are to the Russians and the Chinese.
Mm. And the last question would go, and will be about the general impression. How does it feel in DC these days after transition to Biden? We haven't talked in a while, as I said before. After Kabul, with COVID, with this EU-US rift, with the Germans not following the US leadership.
French.
And French with with the submarine deal, the world ocean, the English speaking nations get together against this continent, and so on, this style. So just please try to mix all my questions into one melting pot, so to speak. And what is the mood? Do you still have the stomach for great power competition, or you're losing already? Just Brandon, tell me, because from Europe, it doesn't look very promising, honestly.
Well, I can tell you that I split my time now. I actually moved. I don't full-time live in DC anymore because I had to get out of there. People there are very pessimistic. When I go back there for work and these events that I do with the military people usually are they know what needs to be done for the most part. But as one of them told me, we're not ever given the orders from the political leaders to do what needs to be done, whether it's in space, whether it's whatever. They're not able to use the full power and capability of the United States to protect the national interests and also the international system that Europe and so much of the world has really gotten fabulously wealthy off of and well protected from. And with the Biden administration, there does seem to understandably be a greater focus on domestic issues. Although, as I've written for months now at the Asia Times, there is a direct correlation between the domestic agenda and the foreign policy agenda, particularly with infrastructure. Infrastructure has national security implications. But we have a president right now, and I don't want to get too political, but we have a president right now who seems to not even be able to get his own party to pass an infrastructure agenda that he has been pushing for since he ran for office. And so what that means is Washington, they seem to be in a daze. They came out of the 4 years of the Trump administration, where the Trump administration was very much at war with them. And now they're in an administration that they thought would be friendlier and sort of more competent and a little bit, smoother dealing on the world stage. And what they're finding is that President Biden is ham-fisted and haphazard in just about everything that he's trying to do. The Kabul pullout is a great example. I don't know anybody in DC who thought that was a good thing. Now, I happen to think we needed to draw down in Afghanistan, but the way we did it was so ridiculous. We'll be paying for that for years to come. The AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US submarine agreement that you just mentioned, needed to happen. But again, the way in which it went about, we alienated France, which is a major nuclear power, which actually does have strategic interests in the Pacific and actually might have been very helpful to the Americans the way that they were helpful to the Americans in Africa for the last decade. And so there is this sense in DC, this sort of depression, this malaise, to use a favorite term from the 70s, wherein the policymakers in DC did not like the previous administration, but they also now are realizing that the current administration is not up to the challenge. And I'm not even convinced, honestly, that the current administration is even very serious about rising to the geopolitical challenge. We have people like Kurt Campbell. We have people like Jake Sullivan, people like that who are more hawkish on China, but they're not the only voice in the administration. You've got people like Susan Rice and John Kerry who have a very wide portfolio, and the two of them have many years of foreign policy experience across multiple Democratic administrations. They have a lot of pull, and they picked a lot of the foreign policy workers in the Biden administration during the transition. And they certainly do not favor a harder line stance against China. In fact, what they want to do is get the mother of all deals on China with the global warming. And so this is something that I think is going to keep coming up, that Biden also wants to get this deal. So in the long term, I think you've got people in DC recognizing finally China's a threat. They've got the administration they've wanted rather than the Trump administration, but the new administration is not doing what they want, and they're not doing it in a way that's competent or cogent. And that spells disaster, because as we see, with the world, they're looking at us going, yeah, you're the biggest military, but you're not performing well. You lost Iraq. You've lost Afghanistan. How can you protect Taiwan? How can you protect Japan? How can you protect Poland from these bigger, ground-based continental authoritarian powers like Russia or China. And I think new calculations are being made, and it's not in America's best interest. And once that shift happens, my fear is that we're going to get left out of the whatever new order forms. Look at the Valdai conference, the Valdai conference that Putin was just at a few weeks ago, in which he basically gave one of the most aggressive anti-American speeches since his 2007 Munich Security Conference speech. And in the process, he seriously said, we are now witnessing the birth of a new world order. It is going to be led by a consortium of powers: China, Russia, Iran, Turkey. He listed all of these authoritarian states. And so whether that comes to pass or not, you now have this sort of idea taking hold in the heart of Eurasia. And it's not a pro-American one. And if they appear to be more powerful and more attractive and have greater staying power to our allies in Europe, like Germany or France, or to our allies in Asia and in the Middle East or Africa, eventually that world order will shift away from the Americans and go to something less desirable.
Okay. I hope that this is not a conclusion from our conversation, but I ask you a frank question about your sincere assessment of the mood in DC and and elsewhere across US. So that probably promises the hope that we will talk again soon about geopolitical status, including, of course, some space elements as always. Thank you very much, Brandon. My guest today was Brandon Weichert. And you please stay with us with Strategy and Future for the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacek.